Hey YouTube, this is Think Museums, and today we are visiting Mt Vernon. This is a popular home here in the United States because it's the home of George Washington, the founding father of the United States. He owned 317 enslaved people, and most of them are buried in these grounds. George Washington himself is buried here in his home in Mt Vernon. So please join us as we perform a ceremony in honor of the enslaved Africans buried here in Mt Vernon.
One says 122 enslaved, and then the other one says 317.
So 317 total enslaved people here at Mt Vernon. 123 of the enslaved were owned by General Washington. The rest were part of the Custis estate. Here at the cemetery, we do not know who was buried here and how many people were buried here. What we do know is that in 1799, Mt Vernon was the home to an enslaved community of 317 enslaved men, women, and children who lived and worked here and had no choice but to do so. While here during General Washington and Mrs. Washington's lifetime, we do know this was a cemetery for the enslaved people. However, people chose to ignore and forget the history of slavery here at Mt Vernon as well as throughout the United States. So over time, especially after General Washington and Mrs. Washington died, and later when the Mt Vernon Ladies Association purchased the property in 1858, any remnants of what was the cemetery were overgrown and forgotten about. So as a result, there are a lot of descriptions from General Washington's time as well as from the time in which the descendants of General Washington and Mrs. Washington lived here, saying that there were 15 graves, saying that there were 150 graves. And it's something that we are constantly doing work to try to figure out how many enslaved people were buried here. Since 2014, we've been doing some archaeology. We're not disturbing any of the remains that are here. We're removing a top layer of soil and then using radar and sonar technology to identify who and what are here. To date, we've identified 87 graves here at the cemetery. However, as I had mentioned, the cemetery became forgotten about. Eventually, though, the Mt Vernon Ladies Association in 1929 placed the first memorial for the enslaved people here that were here at Mt Vernon during General Washington and Mrs. Washington's lifetime. But even like the cemetery, people chose to ignore and forget it, and this place became overlooked and forgotten about. Eventually, though, in 1982, the Washington Post published an article about the neglected cemetery, about the neglected memorial, working on information that was readily known in the local African American community around Mt Vernon. And a group of influential citizens and activists put pressure on the Mt Vernon Ladies Association to remember the history of slavery here at Mt Vernon, to recognize the memorial and cemetery that are here. And as a result, in 1983, they placed this memorial here. And what you're seeing is a gray truncated column to represent life unfinished, with 3 circles around it, each representing different virtues that sustain those living in slavery here at Mt Vernon, including love, hope, and faith. This was designed by architecture students at Howard University, which is a university in Washington, D.C., and every year since, we've continued to do wreath-laying ceremonies, particularly every October. The Black Women United for Action comes to Mt Vernon, who were really crucial to having this memorial placed in 1983 to pay their respects to the cemetery, to the memorial, and the work that they did. Though, however, we don't know who was buried here. As a result, for this ceremony, we read brief biographies, brief tributes, in order to pay respects and remember those that were enslaved here and that very well might have been buried here. We have some guesses. For instance, William Lee, who was freed in General Washington's will in 1799 and died many years after receiving his freedom. We believe he may have been buried here. We also believe Westford, who was an enslaved man brought to Mount Vernon by Bushrod Washington, the nephew of General Washington, who inherited Mount Vernon after General Washington and Mrs. Washington died, and was later freed by Bushrod Washington's family. We believe he may have been buried here because he was incredibly crucial to the preservation and what we know about Mount Vernon during the Washington's ownership, as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association brought him back here to help with that. So 1 or 2 people to read brief biographies and another person to move the wreath itself. So is anyone interested in doing any of those? What would you like to do?
I can read a biography.
Anyone else interested in potentially reading? Anyone interested in moving the wreath itself?
Oh, I could not.
We're now going to read some brief tributes to those that were enslaved here at Mount Vernon so we can honor, pay our respects, and remember. So I'd like to ask our first volunteer to read for us.
It is my pleasure to celebrate the life of Nancy Carter Quander. Nancy Carter lived and worked at River Farm. At age 16, she was among the enslaved people emancipated by George Washington's will. Carter eventually married Charles Quander, a free black man from Maryland and a member of one of the oldest African American families in America. Nancy Carter Quander returned to Mount Vernon in 1835 to cook for the formerly enslaved people and their relatives who worked on the landscape around Washington's new tomb. Descendants of the Quander family continue to live in the local area today. Today we remember Nancy Carter Quander.
It is my pleasure to celebrate the life of Caesar. Caesar was a field worker at Union Farm and a minister who preached to the local African American community. Caesar could read and write, which provided an advantage in running away. Caesar ran away from Mount Vernon at least 4 times, but returned or was recaptured each time. Some of his escapes were apparently to see family members who lived on other plantations near Mount Vernon. Caesar was the property of Martha Washington's family, and he was inherited by Mrs. Washington's granddaughter, Martha Park Custis Peter. Today we remember Caesar.
I just walked from the memorial of the enslaved people that passed away. We just finished the ceremony, which was very solemn. So that's how it is. This is the George Washington plantation. George Washington was the founding father of the United States. And in this farm, he had over 132 slaves. And in total, there were 370 something slaves. Some of them were rented from other plantations. But this is how it is. Very interesting place, very huge. Yeah.